Hi, we did our senior project on the representation of violence and murder in mass media. I'm Kayla Sparks.
I'm Kenia Alba.
I'm Maritza.
I'm Samantha Vasquez.
The goal of our research was to examine how the media represents violence and murder and how that can lead to desensitization, idolization of individuals, and possible increase in the likelihood of violent acts occurring, while also exploring what prevention efforts can be made in order to buffer against these constant violent portrayals in the media.
So in order to kind of talk about this in the paper, we wanted to first go into the classifications of what different kinds of murders are so that we could help differentiate between what is just manslaughter versus what is serial killing and intentional killing. So usually murder falls into one of the three categories, which are manslaughter, justifiable homicide, and other homicides. Different penal codes for different areas kind of change a little bit. So when you look into the first degree, second degree, third degree, that gets a little bit more confusing and just different based on where you are. But most places use these three categories as their main ones that kind of rule on top of all of that. So when manslaughter is committed, it means that the murder was not premeditated and was accidental. Justifiable homicide is a murder that was done as an act of self-defense, and all other homicides just fall under the category of other homicides. So those are just anything that doesn't fall into one of the two categories mentioned before.
The media, specifically the news media, have a wide discretion on how they can report these stories of serial killers and mass murderers. However, we tend to see a trend with regards to these kinds of stories. The language used in the media, specifically here in the United States, frames these individuals as evil or sadistic while also noting how they are such fantastic monsters. The news perceives these individuals as innovators, and what they're doing is never before seen, which is very intriguing for viewers and readers. The focus of the story, as you can see on the infographics, tends to be on the killer themselves rather than the victims or any hero that perhaps saved the day. The representation of these individuals and these crimes tend to be overrepresented in the media, which means that they are showing up in the news media more than they are actually occurring. This can cause panic in individuals and in the public. Ultimately, all these stories lead to a maximization of profits for the news media outlets. People are intrigued by these people and they want to know more about the stories and what kind of went behind the scenes to these individuals. And so people definitely tune in to these news stories when they are happening. With all this being said, these can have detrimental effects on the public at large and create societal and psychological impacts on the pop culture. So we will go into those right now.
Okay, so entertainment and commercialization of mass murder. So a lot of television and streaming services have been one of the most popular means of delivering entertainment, advertising, and information to the general public. So we just note that it's become a recurring theme, not only on mainstream television, but also streaming services alike to use nonfiction and fiction-based stories of serial killers, murders, and mass murder to capture the attentions of audiences. And this has led to an increased societal shared interest in serial killing and mass murder, which is in turn flooding viewers with a lot of true crime stories, biographies, and documentaries revolving around this subject. And to continue on this, we see that there continues to be a favoritism within these shows, and there's a type of symbiotic relationship that exists between the media and serial killers. Such killers offer rich opportunities to capture public attention, and in turn, they capitalized on these deeply resonant themes of innocent victims, dangerous strangers, and unsolved murders, which leads to an intense public interest in this genre and has created an almost celebrity-like culture surrounding these infamous serial killers, which generates public likeness and a cult-like following for a lot of these individuals, despite the public crimes they have committed. So this leads to the role that media has in creating a celebrity status among killers. Right now, technology is a really wide way that we see platforms spread attention and attractiveness to these types of shows and movies that have violent themes and involve violent characters. And although serial killing and mass murder is a statistically low crime, it's a highly media-fueled event. And the general becomes kind of fascinated with more with the killer, and the attention shifts from the victims a lot in these stories. And the public becomes kind of consumed with what the serial killer looks like and their modus operandi and their victim count. So this kind of leads us to the potential buffers that we can do to kind of combat this. So we can draw less attention to the murders, and instead of covering primarily the murder, kind of shift to, news outlets have shifted to covering more victim stories and or kind of heroic actions by any bystanders. And this in turn decreases the level of exposure that the media has with mass murders. And we kind of want to make sure that the victim stories don't get lost in all this media frenzy that happens with a lot of these cases.
So along with this, that we've seen serial killers and violent individuals kind of become sort of these idealistic, like really cool pop culture icons. We've also seen that people tend to become desensitized because of violent media. So there is a constant outpour, whether it be like real news like shows or in fake TV shows that are made up, but we constantly see outpour of violent media to individuals, and this makes them more uncomfortable with seeing violence. The topic is super well studied and it's a heavily researched field. So there's currently studies that have shown that there is not actually a threshold of how long it will take an individual to become desensitized. So that means that there isn't like a limit of like, oh, like we only need to show like this much or else people are gonna be able to like become desensitized. It's kind of just like a, no matter how much they're seeing, if they're even seeing just a little bit or if they're seeing a lot of it, they're going to become desensitized to the violence. And so they will kind of forget that that's not necessarily something that isn't right. And they kind of just forget that like it's a real thing that's actually happening. Along with other effects that have happened, there also seems to be an increased empathy for killers because that's brought on by the media. So we know that there is like an interest in things that have to do with serial killers because we see a higher number of engagement in TV program that includes them in it. And so this interest in them has been said that it comes from the nature of society and the powerful allure to things that are both frightening and incomprehensible, as said by Bond. Serial killers represent a lurid, complex, and compelling presence on social landscape. And it kind of is just a human tendency to want to identify or empathize with all things, whether they're good or bad. And this also includes serial killers. One thing that we talked about specifically in our paper and used as a case study was the TV show Dexter. If you don't know what this is, Dexter is a TV show about a man who is a sociopath, but he's kind of a serial killer who takes on this like Robin Hood persona. He follows a code where he makes sure that he only kills people he knows are guilty. Usually these people have gotten away with the crime and he's seen it happen, so he only uses his killing as a method of vengeance. We see that he like struggles to live like a normal life and not deal with his tendencies. He can't repress them, but you see him being portrayed in a way that makes you empathize with him and makes you want to see him succeed, even though you know that at the end of the day, like, it doesn't matter that he's killing people who are bad. He is still killing a lot of people. All his actions are inhumane, but you kind of forget that because the writers do such a good job of making you believe that he's somebody who's like worth caring about or like worth really listening to. And you can even see this in just sort of the alternate name for the TV show, which is America's Favorite Serial Killer.
Another negative thing that can come from the increase in media representation of these killers is contagion, and the contagion effect simply relies on the premise that the crime itself and the behavior that is associated with the crime is contagious and can give rise to more crimes like it. Humans tend to imitate others, whether they're like us or not like us. We want to feel more with other people that are around us. And so this innate feeling in humans can drive the contagion effect. And the contagion effect is observed also with research surrounding suicide and suicide prevention through the news media. If cases of suicide are more publicized, there tend to be more suicides reported after the initial suicide. And this is found exactly the same with mass murder. When there's an initial mass murder, more tend to follow. And so this is definitely a negative effect in society.
So we know the media's portrayal of violence and murder leads to idolization and desensitization, which both encourage people to commit similar crimes. Bushman used the general aggression model to explain how hostile missiles generate aggressive behavior. The Bushman study revealed that people who were regularly exposed to violent media were more likely to perceive the world in a hostile way and react with hostility. Over time, people can become desensitized to their own violent thoughts. Langman discovered that copycat killers learned about past murderers from various media platforms. Sensationalism in crime reporting inspired the copycat killers to commit copycat crimes. Meindl and Ivey presented the generalized imitation model to explain why the media's current methods of reporting violent events increase copycat behavior. We need to create guidelines for reporting violent crimes and also educate people on how the media sensationalizes murder. The Grahe and Bushing study revealed that courses aimed at reducing consumption of media violence and aggressive behavior were successful at reducing violent thoughts and acts. The Levin and Weiss study showed that people were more interested in reading news reports if the focus was on a heroic bystander rather than the killer or the victims. This strategy draws attention to positive role models. Langford and Madfee suggest that the media refrain from revealing murderers' names and pictures. Meindl and Ivey suggest using a neutral tone while reporting, not doing live press events, describing violent crimes broadly, leaving murderers anonymous, presenting characteristics of others in a negative light, withholding the killer's motive, and not rewarding murderers with weeks of media attention. These potential solutions have the power to prevent desensitization, idolization, and sensationalism.